We're live. Let me just make sure that the audio is working. Okay, it's great. Now, I do apologize for that minor interruption. As you could see in the title, today we are doing something a little bit different. I call it a live book reading. On these live book readings, I am going to just be reading you a book live. I might do something else if I feel like it, but for now I'm just going to read you a book live. Which book will that be? Charles Darwin's magnum opus, The Origin of Species. I went to the bookstore today and I bought this because it was a used bookstore at my library. It was only $4, so I thought, hey, why not? Anyway, let's start where all things start. At least all good things at the beginning. First page. I'm going to be reading through the introduction to chapter 1, and then we'll pick up on it later. Charles Darwin, The Origin of Sound. The Origin of Species, my apologies. With an introduction by Sir Julian Huxley. I was thinking of The Sound of Music. 150th Anniversary Edition. Signet Classics. The Theory That Shook the World. Few other books have created such a lasting storm of controversy as The Origin of Species. Darwin's theory that species derive from other species by a gradual evolutionary process and that the average level of each species is heightened by the survival of the fittest stirred up popular debate to a fever pitch. Its acceptance revolutionized the course of science. As Sir Julian Huxley, the noted biologist, points out in his illuminating introduction, the importance of Darwin's contribution to modern scientific knowledge is almost impossible to evaluate. Quote, a truly great book, one which can still be read with profit by professional biologists. Unquote. Quote, Darwin was one of history's towering geniuses and ranks within the greatest heroes of man's intellectual progress. Unquote. From George Gaylord Simpson in The Meaning of Evolution. Charles Darwin, The Origin of Species, by means of natural selection of the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life, with an introduction by Sir Julian Huxley. Signet Classics. Signet Classics, published by New American Library, a division of Penguin Group USA Incorporated, 375 Hudson Street, New York, New York, 10014 USA. Penguin Group Canada, 90 Eglinton Avenue East, Suite 700, Toronto, Ontario, M4P2Y3, Canada, a division of Pearson Penguin Canada Incorporated. Penguin Books Limited, 80 Strand, London, WC2R 0RL, England. Penguin Ireland, 25 St. Stephen's Green, Dublin 2, Ireland, a division of Penguin Books Limited. Penguin Group, Australia, 250 Camberwell Road, Camberwell, Victoria 3124, Australia, a division of Pearson Australia Group Party Limited. Penguin Books India, PBT Limited, 11 Community Center, Panch Sheel Park, New Delhi, 110017, India. Penguin Group New Zealand, 67 Apollo Drive, Rosedale, North Shore 0632, New Zealand, a division of Pearson New Zealand Limited. Penguin Books South Africa, Party Limited, 24 Sturdy Avenue, Rosebank, Johannesburg, 2196, South Africa. Penguin Books Limited, registered offices, 80 Strand, London WC2R0RL, England. Published by Signet Classics, an imprint of New American Library, a division of Penguin Group USA Inc., previously published in a Mentor edition. First Signet Classics printing, September 2003. 20, 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, 12. Introduction Copyright Symbol New American Library, a division of Penguin Group USA Incorporated, 1958. All rights reserved. Signet Classics logo registered trademark, M. Marca Registrada, printed in the United States of America. If you published If you purchase this book without a cover, you should be aware that this book is stolen property. It was reported as unsold and destroyed to the publisher, and neither the author nor the publisher has received any payment for this stripped book. Darwin's dead. I don't think he would have gotten paid anyway, since this is in the public domain. That's the scanning, uploading, and distribution of this book via the internet or any other means without the permission of the publisher is illegal and punishable by law. Please purchase only authorized electronic editions and do not participate in or encourage electronic piracy of copyrighted materials. Your support of the author's rights is appreciated. Contents: Introduction, page X. An historical sketch, page 14. The Origin of Species, Introduction, page 3. Chapter 1, Variation under Domestication, page 9. Causes of variability, effects of habit in the use of or disuse of parts, correlated variation, inheritance, character of domestic varieties, difficulty of distinguishing between varieties and species, origin of domestic varieties from one or more species, domestic pigeons, their differences in origin, principles of selection, anciently followed, their effects, methodical and unconscious selection, unknown origin of our domestic productions, circumstances favorable to man's power of selection. Chapter 2, Variation under Nature, page 42. Variability, individual differences, doubtful species, wide ranging, much diffused, and common species vary most. Species of the larger genera in each country vary more frequently than the species of the smaller genera. Many of the species of the larger genera resemble varieties in being very closely, but unequally, related to each other, and in having restricted ranges. Chapter 3, Struggle for Existence, page 60, 6-0. Its bearing on natural selection, the term used in a wide sense, geometrical ratio of increase, rapid increase of naturalized animals and plants, nature of the checks to increase, competition universal, effects of climate, protection from the number of individuals, complex relations of all male animals and plants throughout nature, struggle for life most severe between individuals and varieties of the same species, often severe between species of the same genus, the relation of organism to organism, the most important of all relations. Chapter 4, Natural Selection, or the Survival of the Fittest, page 76, 7-6. Natural selection, its power compared with man's selection, its power on characters of trifling importance, its power at all ages and on both sexes. Sexual selection, on the generality of intercrosses between individuals of the same species. Circumstances favorable and unfavorable to the results of natural selection, namely intercrossing, isolation, number of individuals. Slow action, extinction caused by natural selection, divergence of character related to the diversity of inhabitants of any small area and to naturalization. Action of natural selection, through divergence of character and extinction, on the descendants from a common parent, explains the grouping of all organic beings. Advance in organization, low forms preserved, convergence of character, indefinite multiplication of species. Summary. Chapter 5, Laws of Variation, page 128. Effects of changed conditions, use and disuse combined with natural selection, organs of flight and of vision, acclimatization, correlated variation, compensation and economy of growth, false correlations, multiple rudimentary and lowly organized structures variable, parts developed in an unusual manner are highly variable, specific characters variable, species of the same genus vary in an analogous manner, reversions to long lost characters. Summary. Chapter 6, Difficulties of the Theory, page 160. Difficulties of the theory of descent with modification, absence or rarity of transitional varieties, transitions in habits of life, diversified habits in the same species, species with habits widely different from those of their allies, organs of extreme perfection, modes of transition, cases of difficulty, natura non facit saltum, organs of small importance, organs not in all cases absolutely perfect, the law of unity of type and of the conditions of existence embraced by the theory of natural selection. Chapter 7. Miscellaneous objections to the theory of natural selection. Page 201. Longevity. Modifications not necessarily simultaneous. Modifications apparently of no direct service. Progressive development. Characters of small functional importance. The most constant. Supposed incompetence of natural selection to account for the incipient stages of useful structures. Excuse me. Cases which interfere causes, which interfere with the acquisition through natural selection of useful structures. Gradations of structure with changed functions, again. Widely different organs and members of the same class, developed from one and the same source. Reasons for disbelieving in great and abrupt modifications. Chapter 8. Instinct, page 244. Instincts comparable with habits, but different in their origin. Instincts graduated. Aphids and ants. Instincts variable. Domestic instincts, their origin. Natural instincts of the cuckoo, Molothrus, ostrich, and parasitic bees. Slave-making ants. Hive bee, its cell-making instinct. Changes of instinct and structure not necessarily simultaneous. Difficulties of the theory of the natural selection of instincts. Neuter or sterile insects. Summary. Chapter 9. Hybridism. Distinction between the sterility of first crosses and of hybrids. Sterility various in degree, not universal, affected by close interbreeding, removed by domestication. Laws governing the sterility of hybrids. Sterility not a special endowment, but incidental on other differences. Not accumulated by natural selection. Causes of the sterility of first crosses and of hybrids. Parallelism between the effects of changed conditions of life and of crossing. Excuse me. Dimorphism and trimorphism. Fertility of varieties when crossed, and of their mongrel offspring. Not universal. Hybrids and mongrels compared, independently of their fertility. Summary. Chapter 10. On the imperfection of the geological record. On the absence of page 314. On the absence of intermediate varieties at the present day. On the nature of extinct intermediate varieties, on their number. On the lapse of time as inferred from the rate of denudation of a disposition. On the lapse of time as inferred from the rate of denudation and of disposition. On the lapse of time as estimated by years. On the poorness of paleontological collections. On the intermittence of geological formations. On the denudation of granitic areas. On the absence of intermediate varieties in any one formation. On the sudden appearance of groups of species. On their sudden appearance in the lowest known fossiliferous strata. Antiquity of the habitable earth. Chapter 11. On the geological succession of organic beings. Page 345. On the slow and successive appearance of new species. On their different rates of change. Species once lost do not reappear. Groups of species follow the same general rules in their appearance and disappearance as do single species. On extinction. On simultaneous changes in the forms of life throughout the world. On the affinities of extinct species to each other and to living species. On the state of development of ancient forms. On the succession of the same types within the same areas. Summary of preceding and present chapters. Chapter 12. Geographical distribution. Page 375. Present distribution cannot be accounted for by differences in physical conditions. Importance of barriers. Affinity of the productions of the same continent. Centers of creation. Means of dispersal by changes of climate and of the level of the land, and by sorry, and by occasional means. Dispersal during the glacial period. Um, Alternate glacial periods in the north and south. Chapter 13. Geographical distribution. Continued, page 407. Distribution of freshwater productions on the inhabitants of oceanic islands. Absence of batrachians and of terrestrial mammals. On the relation of the inhabitants of islands to those of the nearest mainland. On colonization from the nearest source with subsequent modification. Summary of the last and present chapters. Chapter 14. Mutual affinities of organic beings. Morphology. Embryology. Rudimentary organs. Classification. Groups of. What? I'm reading live. Yes. I'm reading. I'm on live right now reading. It's okay. On the relation of the inhabitants of islands to those of the nearest mainland. On colonization from the nearest source with subsequent modification. Summary of the last and present chapters. Chapter 14. Mutual affinities of organic beings. Morphology. Embryology. Rudimentary organs. Chapter 430. Page 430. My apologies. Classification, group subordinate to groups, natural system, rules and difficulties in classification explained on the theory of descent with modification. Classification of varieties, descent always used in classification, analogical or adaptive chapters, affinities, general, complex, and radiating extinction, separates and defines groups, morphology between members of the same class, between parts of the same individual, embryology, laws of, explained by variations not supervening at an early age and being inherited. At a corresponding age, rudimentary organs, their origin explained, summary. Chapter 15. Recapitulation and conclusion, page 478. Recapitulation of the objections to the theory of natural selection, recapitulation of the general and special circumstances in its favor, causes of the general belief in the immutability of species, how far the theory of natural selection may be extended, effects of its adoption in the study of natural history, concluding remarks. Glossary of scientific terms, page 508. Index, page 525. Introduction by Sir Julian Huxley. It is appropriate that this new edition of The Origin of Species should appear during the centenary year of Darwin and Wallace's joint paper at the Linnean Society, July 1st, 1858, for it was the bombshell of Alfred Russel Wallace's independent discovery of the principle of natural selection which stimulated Darwin to publish his book. He had been convinced of the mutability of species, what we should now call their evolution, by his experiences on HMS Beagle, and had been collecting facts bearing on the subject since 1837. My apologies for laughing. It's just I'm doing this to be absurd. But his cautious and almost diffident temperament held him back from publishing his conclusions, whose acceptance he fully realized would mean a revolution in scientific and general thought, until he could support them with adequate facts. Indeed, it was not until 1842 that he, quote, allowed himself the satisfaction, quote, of writing out a brief 35-page abstract of his theory. 2 years later, he enlarged this into an, quote, essay, quote, though an essay of 230 pages, which is really a first draft of The Origin. However, he showed this only to Lyell and Hooker, and corresponded about his conclusions with Asa Gray. For 15 further years, he went on elaborating his ideas and collecting facts in support of them, with a view to publishing a truly convincing work, a, quote, very big, unquote, book, quote, as perfect as ever I could make it, unquote. And if it had not been for Wallace's moment of inspiration in tearing it, I need to burp, excuse me. Excuse me. When the idea of natural selection flashed into his fever-stimulated brain, Darwin might well have continued doing so for another 15 years, and the resultant book might have been unreadably monumental. As it is, The Origin was written in the short space of little over a year. It was the production of a white heat of urgency working on the fruits of 22 years industry and reflection. It is interesting to note that even as Darwin presented the manuscript to his publisher, his characteristic wariness did not leave him. He wrote to John Murray, quote, "Accept your offer, but I feel bound for your sake and my own to say in clearest terms that if after looking over part of the MS you do not think it likely to have a remunerative sale, I completely and explicitly free you from your offer." Unquote. Asterisk. Such was his comment accompanying the emergence of a truly great book, one which, after a century of scientific progress, can still be read with profit by prof- professional biologists. Why is The Origin of Species such a great book? First of all, because it convincingly demonstrates the fact of evolution. It provides a vast and well chosen body of evidence showing that existing animals and plants cannot have been separately created in their present forms, but must have evolved from earlier forms by slow transformation. And secondly, because the theory of natural selection, which The Origin so fully and so lucidly expounds, provides a mechanism by which such transformation could and would automatically be produced. Natural selection rendered evolution science natural solution rendered evolution scientifically intelligible. It was this more than anything else which convinced professional biologists like Sir Joseph Hooker, T. H. Huxley, and Ernst Haeckel. In neither case did Darwin shrink from drawing the most general conclusions. To begin with, he realized that evolution must be a universal phenomenon. If different species of ground finches or armadillos could be produced by evolution from a common ancestor, then, given enough time, the same must hold for different families, orders, and classes, and for the diversity of life as a whole. All living organisms must be related through their common descent from some simple original stock. Further, since all organisms vary, and all reproduce themselves in greater numbers and can survive, there must always be income. there, there must always be in competition between variants. In other words, the principle of natural selection, too, is universally applicable for these reasons. Wallace himself rightly styled Darwin, quote, the Newton of natural history, unquote, or as we should now say of biology. Each introduced the ideas of unity, order, and universally applicable principle into an enormous realm of experience. In 1859, the area of biological ignorance was very large. Asterisk from the earlier asterisk. You do not think it likely to have a remunerative sale. I completely and explicitly free you from your offer. Quoted by kind permission of Sir John Murray. Nothing was known of the mechanisms of fertilization, heredity and variation, nor of embryonic differentiation. The scientific study of animal behavior, biogeography, and ecology had scarcely begun. No good paleontological series, like those of horse or elephant evolution, had been discovered, nor any fossils bearing on the ancestry of man, and the timescale admitted by geologists and physicists was grossly inadequate. Yet in Yet, in spite of this, Darwin in The Origin gave a remarkably good general picture of the evolutionary process and followed out the implications of natural selection in a quite astonishing way. Excuse me. Thus, he deduced that natural selection must inevitably bring. must inevitably bring about the quote, improvement, unquote, of organisms. Improvement which, as he characteristically added, was always in relation to the conditions of life. This, though he did not himself claim it, was in fact another universal biological law, covering detailed adaptations to particular circumstances, like the resemblance of leaf insects to leaves, specializations for a particular mode of life,
like that of the horses for rapid running and grazing,
advances in efficiency of major functions,
like flight or vision or coordination of behavior,
or improvements in general organizational plan,
like that of arthropods as against segmented worms, or of placentals as against primitive mammals.
He also deduced the inevitability of divergence or diversification, the fact that any successful type would inevitably diverge into two or more diverse types, each adapted to a somewhat different habitat or niche or way of life. This, too, could have been formulated as a universal biological law, for it operates, as Darwin showed, on every scale, from the formation of geographical races within a single species, through cases like that of the single groundfinch ancestor on the Galapagos splitting into a number of distinct genera and species, to the radiation of a large subclass like that of placental mammals into numerous orders, each with its own way of life, up to the divergence of plants from animals. Indeed, as he also pointed out, diversification is itself a biological advantage since it enables a given area to support a greater bulk of living matter. In general, makes it possible for life to exploit the resources of the environment more fully. Though later evolving groups are more highly organized, he rightly he rightly argued that we should not expect all groups and types of organisms to evolve in the direction of higher organization. Thus, single celled forms,
Through the very fact of their small size and rapid reproduction, fill a certain natural niche more successfully than larger multicellular creatures can do. He further showed that natural selection by its nature could never cause or promote evolution of a character which was primarily of advantage to another species. This is a negative generalization as important in its way as the impossibility of perpetual motion as in physical science. Science.
he anticipated modern evolutionary genetics by deducing that large species with an abundance of individual members and large genera containing many species will be more variable than small ones and more likely to produce new species in the course of evolution. Of course, his views have often had to be modified in detail. This is especially true when he is discussing heredity and variation, since in his day, the mechanisms of genetics and mutation were completely unknown. There was a period from about 1895 to about 1925 when Darwinism came in for a great deal of criticism, sometimes violent, from many of the leading biologists at the time. They questioned the very notion that characters such as cryptic or warning coloration are advantageous or adaptive, and indeed were inclined to dismiss the whole idea of adaptation contemptuously as mere teleological speculation. The Lamarckians and the Vitalists rejected the idea of natural selection as too materialistic and as giving insufficient weight to will and effort and other psychological forces. The early Mendelians, fascinated by the discovery of genetic units, gene differences with large effects, such as hornlessness in cattle or albinism in many vertebrates, wanted to make mutation responsible for positive evolutionary change and assigned to natural selection only the essentially negative function of getting rid of harmful variants. Many of them rejected the idea of slow biological improvement and the gradual evolution in favor of stepwise mutational changes of large extent. The possible the position was finally complicated by the fact that the biometricians, preoccupied with the gradual variation so often found in nature, wanted to deny the importance of Mendelism and confuse the heritable variations of character produced by changes in the genes with the non heritable ones produced by changes in the environment. Eventually, however, these various contradictions were reconciled. Lamarckian and vitalistic explanations were ruled out when it was shown that acquired characters, whether impressed by the environment or resulting from use of individual effort, were never inherited. The advance of genetics
So the large mutations were rarer and of far less biological importance than those of small extent, and that apparently continuous evolutionary change could be, and often was, brought about by the accumulation of numerous small discontinuous mutations under the guidance of natural selection. And finally, R.A. Fisher in 1930 made it clear that the fact of heredity being particulate, dependent on distinct self reproducing units of genes, each of which could mutate into new self reproducing forms, and the further fact that most mutants are recessive, and once got rid of the fact that most mutants are at once got rid of the major difficulties that beset Darwin, who accepted the current view of linear heredity, the view that characters in the entities that determine them were commingled into a single blend. When crossed, this would imply that any new character would be progressively diluted by crossing in each generation, and would make its establishment in the stock difficult. But a particular genetic mutant. I've spent the past 30 minutes doing nothing. I'm sorry. But a particular genetic mechanism in which most mutants are in which most mutants are recessive makes it makes it possible for new mutants to be stored indefinitely in the constitution, and for new combinations of new and old genes to be formed, ready to be utilized by selection when conditions are favorable. Natural selection was seen not as involving the sharp alternatives of life or death, but as a result of the differential survival of variants, and it was established that even slight advantages of 1/2 of 1% or less could have important evolutionary effects. With this, Darwinism took on a new lease of life. Neo Darwinism, as we may call the modern theory of gradual transformation, operated by natural selection, acting on a Mendelian genetic outfit of self reproducing and self varying genes, is fully accepted by the great majority of students of evolution. Darwin would have rejoiced to see how, even in the light of our enormously increased knowledge, it, and it alone, can account for the varied and often puzzling facts of evolution. The different types and degrees of adaptation, the, geologically speaking, rapid transformation of some types side by side with the unchanged persistence of others, the coexistence of lower and higher forms, the succession of constantly more improved types, extinction, the facts of geographical distribution, the evolution of insect societies based on elaborate instincts. Darwin's today, a century after the publication, the evolution of insect societies based on elaborate instincts. Today, a century after the publication of The Origin, Darwin's great discovery, the universal principle of natural selection, is firmly and finally established as the sole agency of major evolutionary change. In The Origin, Darwin had already adumbrated many ideas which he or others afterward followed out in more detail. Thus, mentions the existence of plants with three types of flower, like primroses, and explains it as a means of avoiding self-fertilization and inbreeding. A subject which he amplified in two books published in 1876 and 1877. He explained how psychological characters, like instincts and emotions, could and would be evolved by natural means, though it was not until 1872 that, with his remarkable book, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, he initiated the comparative study of animal behavior, or ethology as it is now called. By his constant emphasis on the complicated web of interrelations between different organisms in a given habitat or region, he laid the foundations for the new and flourishing branch of science now known as ecology.
In The Origin, he briefly outlines his theory of sexual selection, which he later, in 1871, developed at great length in his big book, The Descent of Man. He regarded sexual selection as a subsidiary mechanism of evolution, needed to account for the development of male secondary sexual characters, notably weapons like stag's antlers or exaggerated plumes and conspicuous displays like those of many male birds. Though this theory has been bitterly attacked, often by those without adequate knowledge of the facts, and has had to be modified in various particulars, it provides another example of Darwin's originality and insight. He correctly deduced that such characters, though irrelevant in the general struggle for existence or in competition with other
Coco Caca time!
or in competition with other species, would be of advantage in what he called the struggle for reproduction, which which must exist between which would be of advantage in what he called the struggle for reproduction, which must exist between differently endowed males. Differently endowed males. Wow. Selection here is therefore sexual, or as the modern formulation of more correctly puts it, intrasexual, between members of the same sex. It is indeed the best example of intraspecific selection, the result of competition between members of the same species, and the resultant characters, for instance, the fantastically exaggerated wings of the Argus pheasant, may even be a disadvantage in the struggle for existence. Further, though most courtship display characters are directed to raise the female's readiness to perform the act of mating rather than towards her choice of one male rather than another as a mate, it remains true that, as Darwin suggested, they exert their effect via the sense organs, mind and brain of another individual, in this case the female. Oh my god, Darwin, I don't know what to do. They are among the most obvious examples of such
Allisthetic
characters, as we now style them. Thus, Darwin had hit on the important principle that selection could be of different types, acting in different and sometimes contradictory ways. And through different operational channels. Though Darwin was cautious not to put forward unsupported conclusions, once he had established the validity of his ideas to his own satisfaction, he did not hesitate to draw the fullest implications from them, though even here, his modesty was always in evidence. Thus, at the end of The Origin, he writes that when his and Wallace's views, quote, or analogous views of the origin of species are generally admitted, we can dimly foresee that there will be a considerable revolution in natural history, unquote.
exclamation mark.
He then proceeds to much firmer prophecies, all of which have come true. Quote, a grand and almost untrodden field of inquiry will be opened on the causes and laws of variation, on correlation, on the effects of use and disuse. Unquote. Quote, our classifications will come to be, as, as far as they can be so made, genealogies, and will then truly give what they may be called the plan of creation. Unquote. Quote, psychology will be based on a new foundation. Ah, unquote. And finally, that immortal understatement. Quote, light will be thrown in the origin of man and his history. Unquote. Today we can go much further. Owing to Darwin, our entire picture of man and of his place and role in nature has been transformed. At first, the emphasis was on origins. Darwin did not call his great book The Evolution of Life, but The Origin of Species. And when he later came to discuss human evolution, human evolution, his title was not The Ascent, but The Descent of Man. This approach characterized most of the work done during the remainder of the 19th century in the vast field which Darwin had opened up. biologists largely concerned themselves with establishing relationships and constructing forests of family trees. As regards man, it became ever clear that he had originated from an ancestor sufficiently ape-like to be placed in the same group with the existing great apes. Man could no longer be regarded as the lord of creation, a being apart from the rest of nature. He was merely the representative of one among many families of the order primates in the class Mammalia. However, as time went on, the approach changed. The fact of evolution had been established and was no longer in need of further proof. Later, the underlying mechanisms of genetics and variation were discovered, and the principle of natural selection was established. Excuse me. As the method of. I'm sorry. That was so disgusting. I am so sorry. Were discovered, and the principle of natural selection was established as a method of evolution. It now remained to study the course of evolution as a process. This approach yielded several important new points of view. In the first place, not only did discovery still further enlarge the time scale of evolution, so that it now has to be measured not in millions, but in thousands of millions of years, but emphasis began to be laid on its future as well as on its past. It became clear that man had as vast spans of time before him as those he had enjoyed for his earlier entire evolution from his first submicroscopic ancestor. Secondly, evolution came to be increasingly looked at as a process of realization of new possibilities, and so involving an element of progress. And thirdly, evolutionary succession, in which an earlier successful or dominant type is wholly or largely replaced by a new and biologically improved type, began to be studied. Darwin had noted and correctly interpreted a few cases of succession. It now became clear that succession was a widespread and indeed general fact of evolution, and constituted the method by which major evolutionary advance was achieved. The reason that the reptiles was largely replaced by the mammals as dominant land vertebrates was because the mammals were, in a perfectly legitimate sense of the word, higher organisms than the reptiles. And further emerged that man constitutes the latest dominant group and is today, thanks to his new method of evolving by the cumulative transmission of experience, the only type capable of realizing important new possibilities and of achieving further major advances in the future. Thus, in the light of the science of evolutionary biology which Darwin founded, man is seen not just as a part of nature, but as a very peculiar and indeed unique part. In his person, the evolutionary process has become conscious of itself, and is alone is capable of leading it on to realizations of possibility. A century after Darwin's modest statement that light will be thrown onto the origin of man, on the origin of man, we can truly say that, as a result of Darwin's work in general and of the origin of species in particular, light has been thrown onto his destiny. By Sir Julian Huxley. An historical sketch of the progress of opinion on the origin of species previously to the publication of the first edition of this work. I will here give a brief sketch of the progress of opinion on the origin of species. Until recently, the great majority of naturalists believed that species were immutable productions and had been separately created. This view has been ably maintained by many authors. Some few naturalists, on the other hand, have believed that species undergo modification and that the existing forms of life are the descendants by true generation of pre-existing forms. Passing over allusions to the subject in the classical writers, the first author who in modern times has treated it in a scientific spirit, was Buffon. But as his opinions fluctuated greatly at different periods, and as he does not enter on the causes of or means of the transformation of species, I need not here enter it on enter on details. Footnote 1. Aristotle, in his Physicae Auscultationes, lib 2, cap 8, s2, after remarking that rain does not fall in order to make the corn grow, any more than it falls to spoil the farmer's corn when threshed out of doors, applies the same argument to organization, and adds, as translated by Mr. Clara Grease, who first pointed out the passage to me, quote, so what hinders the different parts of the body from having this merely accidental relation in nature? As the teeth, for example, grow by necessity, the front one's sharp, adapted for the biting, and the grinders flat and serviceable for masticating the food, since they were not made for the sake of this, but it was a result of accident. And in like manner as to the other parts in which there appears to exist an adaptation to an end. Wheresoever, therefore, all things together. That is all the parts of one whole. That is all the parts of one whole. Happen, like, as if they were made for the sake of something. These were preserved, having been appropriately constituted by an internal spontaneity. And whatsoever things were not thus constituted perish and still perish. Unquote. We here see the principle of natural selection shadowed forth. But how little Aristotle fully comprehended the principle is shown by his remarks on the formation of the teeth. My apologies. Lamarck was the first man whose conclusions on the subject excited much attention. This justly celebrated naturalist, not nationalist, first published his views in 1801. It has been 47 minutes and 52 seconds. I'm tired. I will start this again on the next live I have. I will start an historical sketch specifically, but I'm sorry. I have to go. Goodbye. Goodbye.